A freezing wind tore across the desolate coast of East Greenland on June 27, 1931. 5 men stood around a wooden flagpole they just hammered into the frozen ground. History tells us this was about Viking pride and ancient claims. History tells us this was about heritage and territorial ambition. History is lying to you. This wasn't about flags or folklore. This was about fox pelts, fishing rights, and foreign currency. Norway didn't invade Greenland because of ancestral honor. Norway invaded Greenland because they were economically desperate. And Denmark didn't fight back with warships. They fought back with ledgers, treaties, and the most devastating weapon in modern geopolitics, a lawyer with receipts. At the height of its power in the 13th century, the Norwegian Empire controlled the entire North Atlantic. Their merchant ships dominated the trade routes from Iceland to the British Isles. They extracted tribute from Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and the Orkney Islands. The royal treasury in Bergen overflowed with walrus ivory, polar bear hides, and dried cod. The Norwegian crown was solvent, expanding, and feared. Their balance sheet was a thing of beauty. Assets exceeded liabilities by a comfortable margin. But empires don't collapse because of military defeat alone. They collapse when the cash flow stops. And for Norway, the cash flow was about to be strangled by a plague, a union, and a treaty written by exhausted diplomats who didn't read the fine print. The Black Death arrived in Norway in 1349 like a creditor collecting on a cosmic debt. It killed between 50 and 60% of the population within 2 years. Farms were abandoned. Tax revenue evaporated. The Norwegian economy didn't just contract, it imploded. The crown's ability to administer distant colonies vanished overnight. Greenland became too expensive to manage. Iceland drifted into administrative neglect. The empire wasn't conquered. It was foreclosed. By 1380, Norway was so financially broken that it entered the Kalmar Union with Denmark and Sweden. But this wasn't a partnership of equals. Denmark held the purse strings. Copenhagen became the capital. The Norwegian throne became a subsidiary. And every asset Norway once owned, every colony, every trade monopoly, every ounce of sovereignty was absorbed into the Danish balance sheet. For over 400 years, Norway existed as a financial province of the Danish crown. They had no independent foreign policy, no control over their own trade, and no claim to their former territories. Then came the Napoleonic Wars. Denmark made the catastrophic mistake of backing Napoleon against Britain and her allies. When Napoleon fell in 1814, the victors gathered to redraw the map of Europe. Denmark had to pay for its bet on the wrong horse. The price was Norway. At the Treaty of Kiel, signed on January 14, 1814, Denmark was forced to cede Norway to Sweden. But the Danish negotiators were sharp. They buried a clause deep in the treaty. Article 4 stated that Denmark would transfer the territory of Norway, but retain all overseas possessions. Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands remained Danish property. The Swedes and Norwegians signed the document without fully understanding what they'd lost. Norway gained independence from Denmark only to be swallowed by Sweden. And they lost every island, every fishing ground, every Arctic asset they once controlled. It was the most elegant theft in diplomatic history. Denmark lost Norway, but kept the empire. For the next century, this economic humiliation festered in the Norwegian soul. They watched as Denmark collected revenues from Greenlandic trade. They watched as Danish ships controlled the fishing zones. They watched as Danish cartographers drew borders around territories discovered by Norwegian Vikings. By 1905, Norway finally broke free from Sweden and became fully independent. But independence without assets is just poverty with a flag. The new Norwegian government looked north and saw an opportunity. East Greenland was a frozen wasteland with no permanent Danish settlements. There were no police, no administration, no tax collectors. Just ice, rock, and foxes. To ambitious Norwegians, it looked like Terra Nullius, nobody's land, free real estate. The Norwegian trappers who began moving into East Greenland in the 1920s weren't explorers. They were entrepreneurs chasing a resource boom. Arctic fox pelts were fetching premium prices in European markets. Polar bear hides were luxury goods. The men who sailed to East Greenland weren't motivated by patriotism. They were motivated by profit margins. But profit and politics are always married. And these trappers had powerful friends in Oslo. Hallvard Devold was the leader of this rough fraternity of hunters. He was a man with weathered hands and a sharp understanding of international law. He knew that possession was 9/10 of ownership. He knew that Denmark's claim to East Greenland was theoretical, not operational. He also knew that if he could force the Norwegian government to back his claim, he could turn a wilderness into a currency-generating asset. By 1930, Denmark realized the Norwegians were getting too comfortable on the east coast. They announced a new policy. All of Greenland was now a closed territory. Any foreign nationals needed a permit to land. It was a bureaucratic blockade designed to choke out the Norwegian trappers. The reaction in Oslo was fury. The trappers formed a lobby group. They had the ear of Vidkun Quisling, the Minister of Defense. Quisling was a nationalist who believed Norway had been economically castrated by Denmark and Sweden. He saw East Greenland as a chance to reclaim lost revenue streams. He urged the government to act before the window closed. Devold understood the game perfectly. If he planted a flag, the government would have to defend him or look weak. So he organized the occupation. On June 27, 1931, Devold and 4 other men raised the Norwegian flag at Myggbukta, which translates to Mosquito Bay. He shouted into the Arctic wind that he was claiming the land in the name of the King of Norway. A telegraph message was sent to Oslo. The news hit the capital like a stock market crash. The public erupted in celebration. Newspapers printed maps showing the new Norwegian territory carved out of Danish Greenland. The government debated for 2 weeks. Then, on July 10, 1931, King Haakon VII issued a royal decree. Norway officially annexed a territory the size of France. The invasion was complete. But there was no army. There were no warships. There were only 5 men, a radio, and a legal argument. Denmark now faced a choice. Go to war or go to court. Prime Minister Thorvald Stauning was a pragmatic socialist who hated waste. He looked at the cost of a naval expedition into the ice and saw a budget black hole. Sending warships into the crushing pack ice to arrest 5 trappers was financial insanity, but Stauning had something better than cannons. He had treaties, old maps, and a newly created international court. The Permanent Court of International Justice had been established in The Hague in 1922. It was designed to prevent wars by turning conflicts into lawsuits. Denmark filed suit against Norway, On July 14, 1931, they demanded the annexation be declared illegal. They demanded full sovereignty over all of Greenland. It was the first time two sovereign nations had fought a territorial war entirely in a courtroom. Both nations mobilized their most dangerous weapons: historians, archivists, and lawyers. Denmark's legal team began excavating the archives of the foreign ministry. They needed proof that Denmark had always intended to govern all of Greenland. They needed proof that Norway had accepted this, and then they found it. A memo from 1919. It was a record of a conversation between the Danish foreign minister and Niels Claus Elin, the Norwegian foreign minister. The discussion happened during a diplomatic conference. It was informal, possibly over drinks. The Danish minister asked if Norway would object to Denmark extending sovereignty over all of Greenland. According to the Danish memo, Elin replied that Norway would not make difficulties. It was a verbal promise. In the world of diplomacy, verbal promises are binding contracts. Norway had already agreed to give up Greenland 12 years earlier, and they'd forgotten about it. The Danish lawyers called it the Elin Declaration. It was the smoking gun. They built their entire case around it. They argued that a foreign minister speaks with the full authority of the crown. When Elin made that promise, he signed away Norway's claim. The Norwegians were blindsided. They scrambled to argue that Elin was speaking informally. They argued he didn't have authority to surrender a continent over cocktails. They argued the memo wasn't a treaty, but the damage was done. The judges in The Hague weren't interested in Viking sagas or ancient settlements. They were interested in signed documents and diplomatic precedent. And Denmark had the receipts. The trial began in 1932. The courtroom was packed with diplomats, spies, and journalists from every major power. This case would set the precedent for territorial claims across the Arctic, the Antarctic, and every uninhabited zone on Earth. The Danish advocate stood and delivered a methodical, devastating case. He laid out the history of the Kalmar Union. He presented the Treaty of Kiel. He showed maps of Danish expeditions to the east coast, and then he revealed the Elin Declaration. He read it aloud in the courtroom. The Norwegian delegation sat in stunned silence. Their entire legal strategy was built on the principle of Terra Nullius. They argued you couldn't own land you didn't use. But Denmark had just proven Norway had already surrendered its claim years ago. The Norwegian team tried to salvage the case. They argued that Denmark had no real presence on the east coast. They argued that Norwegian trappers were the only people actually living there. They pointed out that the Inuit population was nomadic and not formally governed. But the court wasn't interested in boots on the ground. The judges ruled that in polar regions the standard for sovereignty was different. You didn't need towns and tax collectors on every frozen fjord. You just needed intent and the will to act as sovereign. Denmark had signed treaties with other nations that included Greenland. Denmark had laws that applied to the whole island. Denmark had scientific expeditions. That was enough. The court declared that sovereignty in the Arctic didn't require physical occupation. It required legal jurisdiction and international recognition. On April 5, 1933, the verdict was delivered. The Permanent Court of International Justice ruled in favor of Denmark by a vote of 12-2. The Norwegian annexation was declared illegal. The occupation was void. Greenland belonged to Denmark. All of it, the east coast, the ice cap, every frozen bay, and barren rock. The news flashed across the telegraph wires. In Copenhagen, the streets erupted in celebration. Flags were waved, songs were sung. Denmark had won a war without firing a shot. In Oslo, the reaction was shock and bitterness. The newspapers ran headlines bordered in black. It was a national humiliation. The dream of reclaiming the Viking Empire was dead. The trappers felt betrayed by their own diplomats. But then something extraordinary happened. Norway accepted the verdict. They didn't ignore it. They didn't keep their men on the ground. They respected the rule of law. The Norwegian government sent a message to Hallvard Devold at Mosquito Bay. Lower the flag. Leave. Imagine that moment. Devold and his men had risked their lives in the Arctic wilderness. They believed they were founding a new Norwegian province, and now they were being ordered to dismantle their work. They walked out into the snow and lowered the blue cross. They packed their equipment. They didn't sabotage the station. They didn't burn the cabin. They simply left. The invasion was over. The ledger had spoken louder than the rifle. The verdict became the bedrock of international territorial law. It established that you could own vast uninhabited regions without physical occupation. This ruling is why Canada can claim the empty islands of the high Arctic. It's why Russia can claim Siberia. It's why the map of the polar regions looks the way it does today. The court legitimized the concept of owning the wilderness. For Denmark, the victory was absolute. They retained control of the largest island on Earth, and when the strategic value of Greenland exploded during the Cold War, it was Denmark that held the keys. American military bases were built on Danish territory. Nuclear early warning radars were installed under Danish sovereignty. The revenue and geopolitical leverage were immense. If Norway had won, Greenland might have been partitioned. The modern independence movement in Greenland relies on the fact that they are one people on one island. The lawyers in The Hague unknowingly preserved Greenlandic unity. But there was a dark epilogue. Vidkun Quisling, the Norwegian Minister of Defense who pushed so hard for the invasion, was humiliated by the loss. He saw the verdict as proof of Norwegian weakness. This bitterness festered. It contributed to his radicalization. When Nazi Germany invaded Norway in April 1940, Quisling betrayed his own country. He became a puppet dictator for Hitler. His name became synonymous with the word traitor. It's strange to think his path to treason began partly with a failed lawsuit over a frozen bay. The economic humiliation of 1933 fed the nationalist rage that led to collaboration. The Eland Declaration, that drunken promise made in 1919, cost Norway an empire. It was a reminder that in geopolitics the most dangerous weapon isn't a battleship. It's a memo, a handshake, a verbal agreement made by a tired diplomat who didn't realize he was signing away a continent. The Norwegians didn't lose Greenland because they were weak. They lost it because they didn't read the fine print. And when they tried to take it back, they were defeated not by soldiers, but by a legal brief. Today, if you travel to East Greenland, you can still find the ruins of the Norwegian stations. The cabin at Mosquito Bay still stands, preserved as a historical site. It's a monument to ambition and miscalculation. But the most important monument is invisible. It's the line on the map, the border that surrounds Greenland. That line exists because of the lawsuit of 1933. That line was drawn not by admirals but by judges. not by cannons, but by treaties. It's a reminder that history is not written by the brave. It's written by the people who keep the books. The conflict between Denmark and Norway over Greenland is mostly forgotten today. The two nations are close NATO allies. But every time you look at a globe and see the massive white expanse of Greenland colored the same shade as tiny Denmark, you're looking at the result of that lawsuit. You're looking at the power of the ledger. Sovereignty is solvency. The moment Norway promised not to interfere, they lost a legal right to the land. The moment Denmark proved they had intent and recognition, they won the empire. The battle was fought with documents, not divisions, and the victor took everything. This is the story of the only war in history won entirely in a courtroom. A war where the only casualty was national pride. A war that proved the pen is mightier than the sword, but only if the pen is held by a really good lawyer with access to the archives. The Vikings didn't lose Greenland because they were conquered. They lost it because someone else had better paperwork. And in the 20th century, paperwork is destiny. The ledger always wins. The accountants always have the final word. And the nation that forgets this lesson will wake up one day to find their empire has been legally liquidated while they were busy waving flags. Subscribe now. Stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who understand that the real battles aren't fought on fields. They're fought in ledgers, courtrooms, and forgotten diplomatic conversations, and the side that keeps the receipts always wins.